Hospitals are places where life and death are constantly at odds. The air is thick with tension, and the halls are often filled with the sounds of beeping machines, the hushed whispers of staff, and the occasional footsteps echoing in the dead of night. But there's something else that hangs in the air, something unexplainable. Something that watches, waits, and lingers long after the living have gone. It was 1994 when I first stepped into St. Anne's Hospital. I had just started working as a nursing technician, and like many others before me, I was assigned to the night shift. It was a 12-hour shift, starting at 7 p.m. and ending at 7 a.m. The hospital was massive, with thick walls that seemed to absorb sound, and a garden that seemed to belong to another time. The building had an old, eerie feel to it, as though it had been around for centuries. But it wasn't just the age of the structure that felt off. There was something different about it. From the very first night, I noticed the strange energy that hung in the air after 3 a.m. The hospital would fall into a strange silence, broken only by the occasional beep of a machine or the distant footsteps of staff patrolling the halls. It was during these hours that the strange occurrences would begin. One night, while walking down the second-floor surgical wing, I overheard an older nurse, Lucy, whispering about a nurse named Mary Augusta. "Have you heard of her?" she asked me, her voice barely above a whisper. "She was a nurse here a long time ago. If you see her, don't be afraid. She's just here to take care of the patients." At first I thought it was just a ghost story to scare the newbies. But as the days passed, I began to hear more and more about this mysterious nurse who seemed to haunt the hospital long after her death. They said Mary Augusta was a nurse in the 1950s, known for her compassion. She didn't care about money or status. She treated everyone equally. She passed away in 1959 during a flu epidemic, having caught the virus while caring for her patients. But that's not where the story ends. According to the older nurses, Mary Augusta never really left. It started with the strange occurrences. Patients who inexplicably improved during the night, the scent of rubbing alcohol that would appear in empty hallways, and the sound of leather shoes clicking on the floor in the dead of night. Mr. George, the security guard, had worked at St. Anne's for over 30 years, and he would tell me that he had seen her more times than he could count. "She's been around longer than these walls," he'd say with a shrug, like it was no big deal. I didn't believe it at first. That was until one particularly busy night in the surgical wing. I was running from room to room checking on patients when I saw her, a figure in an old-fashioned white nurse's cap walking down the hall. Her presence felt calming, like someone was looking out for us. The next morning, I couldn't explain what had happened, but when I checked the patient's chart in room 204, I saw that the IV had been adjusted, just as Mary Augusta would have done in the past. The strangest part wasn't seeing her, though. It was how everyone else reacted. The older nurses weren't scared. They accepted it as part of the hospital's routine. If something unexplainable happened, they would just shrug and say, "Mary Augusta is on duty tonight." One night, Miss Annie, an older housekeeper, told me the true story of Mary Augusta. "She was the head nurse here back in the day," Miss Annie said, her voice soft as she mopped the floor. "She treated everyone, rich or poor, with the same care. She never asked questions. She just helped." Miss Annie paused, leaning on her broom. "She died in 1959, but she never really left. I first saw her in 1982. I was cleaning the surgical wing late at night when I saw her walk into a patient's room. The next morning that patient had improved and no one knew why." Miss Annie went on, recounting more stories of Mary Augusta's strange appearances. A child who described a nurse in a white cap dressing their wound in the middle of the night, even though no nurse was scheduled. A set of charts that appeared mysteriously in a new order, just like Mary Augusta used to do. I began to believe that Mary Augusta wasn't just a ghost. She was something more. A presence that lingered in the hospital, helping those who needed it most. But it wasn't just Mary Augusta's presence that made the hospital eerie. One night, while doing my rounds, I came across a patient named Mr. Evans. He was an older man who had been bedridden for weeks. His room was always dimly lit, and his eyes seemed to always be fixed on some distant point. But that night, something was different. When I entered his room, I felt a cold chill in the air. I checked his vitals and everything seemed normal. But as I was about to leave, I heard a low hiss, like something was slithering across the floor. I turned around and saw him. Mr. Evans was sitting up in bed, his eyes completely white, as if in a trance. His mouth was open and a faint, twisted smile stretched across his face. I froze in terror. I didn't know what to do, but before I could react, he suddenly stopped, as if snapped out of whatever trance he was in. He turned his head toward me, and his eyes returned to normal. The rest of the night was a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off about Mr. Evans. Later that week, Rosemary, another nurse, told me about an incident that happened in the back wing of the hospital. She had seen Mr. Evans moving strangely, like a serpent slithering across the floor, his eyes rolled back in his head. It wasn't just the patients who were affected by the supernatural occurrences. One night, while standing near the ambulance entrance, a wheelchair suddenly began to move on its own. At first, we thought someone had bumped into it, but no one was near. The wheelchair moved slowly across the floor, as if being pushed by an unseen force. We stood there in shock, unsure of what to do or say. These strange occurrences continued. We heard whispers in empty rooms, saw figures walking down hallways, and felt cold drafts in places where there should have been none. It became clear to me that St. Anne's was a place where the living and the dead coexisted. But there was one thing I knew for sure. As long as Mary Augusta was on duty, the patients were in good hands. One night, after a particularly long shift, I was standing by the nurse's station when I felt a presence behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. I thought I was just imagining things, but the feeling didn't go away. It was as though something or someone was always watching. And every night, as the hours grew later, the hospital seemed to come alive with the memories of those who had passed. It was then that I realized some things can't be explained. Some things can't be ignored. And sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones that you can't see but feel. I never believed in ghost stories. I thought they were just things people told to pass the time during long night shifts. A distraction from the monotony. That was before I started working at Langridge General Hospital. Before I found room 309. I was a third-year nursing student when I took a night job at Langridge. It was supposed to be temporary, just 3 months. Enough to pay rent and survive until my finals. The hospital was old, built in the 1930s, but functional. The kind of place that had seen too many deaths and not enough funding. There were rumors, of course. Every old building has them. Whispers about cold spots in certain corridors. Call buttons lighting up in empty rooms. People seeing things on the CCTV that weren't there in person. But there was one story that kept coming up. Room 309. A room that didn't appear on any current floor plans. One that supposedly had been sealed decades ago. No one would tell me why. Just that it didn't exist anymore. It was my 9th night on shift around 3:08 a.m. I remember the time exactly because I'd just poured coffee from a pot that tasted like burnt rubber. The hallway was silent, the kind of silence that presses on your eardrums. I was near the east wing where the ICU patients were kept. All the lights were dimmed, the staff reduced to a skeleton crew. Then I heard it. A voice, just above a whisper, coming from the intercom behind the nurses' station. "Help me!" I froze. The screen was blank. No one had paged in. Then it crackled again. "Room 309, please." I stared at the board. 309 wasn't on the current roster. Rooms jumped from 308 to 310. I checked again. No call lights. No page. Just that sickening static. The next morning I brought it up with Maggie, one of the older nurses. She had been working there since the late 90s and had a reputation for being tough as nails. "Don't mention that number," she said without looking up from her chart. "Not if you want to keep sleeping at night." "But," she leaned in, "there used to be a room 309 long time ago, back when the 3rd floor was different. It was shut down after something happened, something bad." "Like what?" She shook her head. "No one talks about it. We let it go. You should too." That should have been enough for me. But I was young and curious, and I made the mistake of going down to records. In a dusty cabinet labeled Archived Building Plans, I found a floor layout from 1973. There it was. Room 309, sandwiched between 308 and 310, identical to the other rooms, but with a small note scribbled beside it. Sealed, March 12th, 1981. Do not reopen. The hallway outside room 308 looked normal enough, but the closer I got, the colder the air became. I ran my fingers along the wall between 308 and 310. The paint was smooth, but when I tapped lightly, it echoed differently. Hollow. I used a small inspection light and tilted it. There it was. A faint rectangle. A seam in the plaster. Someone had painted over a door frame. Something in me screamed to leave it alone. But I didn't. Later that night, I borrowed the master key ring from maintenance under the pretense of fixing a broken lock in storage. There were hundreds of keys. I found one labeled Archive 3F. I returned to the hallway. The door was still sealed, but the keyhole was intact, and the key fit. When I turned it, the lock gave a low metallic click. The hallway lights flickered once, twice. Then the air changed. I pushed the door open and the smell hit me first. Old damp wood, rust, and something else, sweet and rotten like decayed fruit. Inside was darkness and silence. The room was small. A single bed, rusted frame, a broken IV stand, yellowing curtains, and on the wall, words, hundreds of them, scrawled in black marker in all directions. He's not gone. It watches from the mirror. 309 is not a room. It's a prison. Don't turn around. Don't look in the mirror. I didn't see a mirror until I turned. There, behind the curtain, was a full-length mirror bolted to the wall, but it didn't reflect the room properly. My flashlight beam didn't bounce back. Instead, the mirror showed something else. A darker version of the room with the bed facing the wrong way, and in the reflection, a man stood behind me. I spun around. Nothing. But the man was still there, in the mirror. Dressed in an old hospital gown, his eyes hollow, skin pale and peeling. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at me through the glass. Then his mouth opened wide, too wide, and he screamed. The sound didn't come from the mirror. It came from behind the wall. I slammed the door shut and ran. After that night, strange things started happening. Call lights going off in sealed rooms, patient monitors flatlining, then returning to normal. Security footage glitching near the east wing. Then Angela disappeared. She was new, a fresh grad. We'd bonded over coffee and bad vending machine food. One night she told me she heard a voice calling her name from behind the wall outside room 308. I told her not to answer it. She laughed it off. The next day, her locker was still locked, her car untouched in the parking lot. But she never clocked out. The wall outside room 308 had been chipped. Someone tried to open the door again. I put in my resignation. Couldn't take it anymore. But on my last night, I stayed late to say goodbye to some coworkers. Around 2:59 a.m., the power went out for a split second. When it returned, every monitor on the floor had reset to the same message. 309. The hallway lights dimmed, and I heard it again. That voice. Help me. Please. He won't let me leave. It wasn't Angela's voice. It was mine. Terrified, I looked down the hallway. The wall where the door had been sealed was open, and standing there, smiling through the dark, was the man from the mirror. But now, he had my face. They say trauma can make you see things. That stress, lack of sleep, and grief can twist your mind. Maybe that's true. But if you ever work the night shift at Langridge Hospital, stay away from room 309, because it doesn't exist. Not on paper, not in maps, not anymore. But it's still there, waiting, and it remembers your name.